It gives me such pleasure to be with you on this holiday weekend, even if it is just virtually. The last time I was with you was for the ordination and installation of my friend and colleague, the Reverend Terrence Strauss, as senior minister of your church. What an amazing moment that was, and I hope and expect it has paid many dividends in time with you since. All around us, Howard Thurman said, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying and life is being born. The fruit ripens on the tree. The roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth, against a time when there shall be new leaves, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung. One more thing to try when all else has failed. The upward reach of life when weariness closes in on all endeavor. This is the basis of hope in moments of despair. If one could speak of the project of Howard Thurman's life, it might be summarized with his hope to communicate that brief meditation, what it conveys, amid the despair, the pain, the suffering that all life may bring. There remains the promise of awakening, a promise rooted in our very being that each of us has the capacity to find and to bring to life. This conviction arose out of a lifetime of teaching and preaching, as well as a personal mysticism that pointed to a growing edge in human awareness that he felt directed us to a path of more abundant life for us all. It's part, I think, of what's drawn people recently back to Howard Thurman as a spiritual guide 40 years after his death. It was the persistent hope of this prophetic voice that his life's work might show the way to the reconciliation of all people, to hope, to peace. Thurman's story has a remarkable beginning. In Daytona Beach, Florida, where he was born in 1897. He told of a tightly knit family that held him in love even after the early death of his father. He told of regular nighttime walks along the Atlantic seashore where he first intuited a deep connection among all things and what he called an island of peace in his soul. But the day-to-day reality was quite different in a town that he described as so segregated that whites and blacks may as well have lived on different planets. He lived at the mercy of any white person, from youth to adult, who could scorn him, abuse him, disregard him in a way that he said just froze him in place. For him, he said, white people were entirely outside of the scope of what he called the magnetic field of my morality. They were not hated, he said, they were simply out of bounds. They were tolerated as part of the environment, but they didn't count in. But Thurman was blessed to be raised by a grandmother whose bounteous love gave him shelter. A former slave, she impressed on Thurman a deep biblical spirituality that affirmed his worth as one of God's children, who she hoped might use what she called the magic of learning to realize all that he could be. And he did. He was the first black youth of Daytona Beach to receive an 8th grade certificate. He then moved on to graduate from a segregated academy in Jacksonville, and then he enrolled in Morehouse College. He graduated as valedictorian and studied briefly at Columbia University, but found his calling at Rochester Theological Seminary. There he was admitted as one of 2 slots that the school set aside for African Americans. But still, he went on to graduate as valedictorian and president of the student body. After school, he served a church in Oberlin, Ohio for a few years, but later moved back to Morehouse and Spelman colleges as director of religious life. Several years later, he left for Howard University, where he was to spend the next 12 years. It was during his stay at Howard that he had an experience that changed his life, a 6-month trip to India in 1933, where he became the first Black American minister to meet Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi told Thurman that there was much that puzzled him about the American church, and especially the way that, in his words, Christianity seemed paralyzed by the color bar. No answer could we give, Thurman said, for I knew no religious institution in which there were no lines drawn. Thurman told of watching camel trains in the Khyber Pass, and he was thrilled by the deep mixing of many faith traditions. He determined that when he returned, he would, in his words, test whether a religious fellowship could be developed in America that was capable of cutting across all religious barriers. Coming back to the U.S., Thurman gave his attention to the apparent flaws in Christianity. Particularly, he said, the way it seemed impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with issues of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin. Was this due, he asked, to some fundamental weakness in the Christian faith? Or in his words, was it a betrayal of the genius of that faith that was to blame? That question became the foundation to what may have been the most important work of his life, Jesus and the Disinherited. He began the book with a stern judgment for those who seek strength and support from their faith, who seek, in his words, to live in the present with dignity and creativity. Christianity often has been sterile and of little avail. The word they receive, he said, is muffled, confused, and vague. The apparent reason for this state of affairs, he said, is that in exchange for security and respectability, the Christian church has chosen to be on the side of the strong against the weak. It struck him as a cruel irony that a tradition born of people acquainted with persecution and suffering had become what he called the cornerstone of civilization and nations, whose very position in modern life was too often secured by the ruthless use of power applied to weak and defenseless peoples. Yes, it was true that the church spoke of expressing concerns for those who were less fortunate, but lurking beneath those words, he said, is a certain contempt for those very people, born of pride and arrogance. Why was that? He decided it was due to the church's failure to recognize who Jesus truly was and what he was teaching. Though now led by powerful and dominant people, Christianity was actually born in the mind of this Jewish teacher and thinker as a technique of survival for the oppressed. He recognized that early Christians who Jesus taught were in a position much like African Americans, being a minority group suppressed by a dominant, controlling group. But these people, he said, were not the ones to whom Jesus aimed his message. No, his teachings were primarily intended for what he called the masses of people who live with their backs constantly against the wall. And those people, he said, faced what he called one overmastering problem. How is survival possible? The most obvious option, he said, was assimilation, isolation, and active resistance. Each, Thurman said, had downsides. Assimilation might assure survival, but it meant yielding oneself to that which, deep within, one recognizes as unworthy. In time, it breeds a loss of self-regard. Isolation may separate me from my oppressors, but in time, he said, it breeds bitterness, hatred, and a deep, calculating fear. Active resistance, he said, has an appeal, but is apt to be tragic in the last resort in the life of the disinherited. So is that all there is? Jesus, he said, came up with one more, which was the center of his ministry. For Thurman, it was summarized in the phrase, "The kingdom of heaven is within us." It was a message central to Thurman's life, went back to his earliest days. He recalled his grandmother teaching the story of the slave preacher who ended every sermon with the assurance, "You are not slaves, you are God's children." I grew up with that story, Thurman told an interviewer late in life. This rooted me in the very significance in life, this that nothing else in my environment could destroy. It is here that Thurman locates the origins of the love ethic that underlies Jesus' ministry. If we understand that there is something irreducible, holy within us, we can imagine it in others as well. It offers a sense of self that each person, no matter what their circumstances, can find within. It puts us on a common plane with all others, whatever their situation, he said, and is the beginning of a shared sense of mutual worth and value. Returning to Howard University after India, Thurman began exploring the consequences of this new theology. He experimented with worship styles intended to make experiences exploring how religion builds community. And in 1944, he seized an opportunity to push that hope even further, leaving Howard to help found a unique church in San Francisco. The Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples was the first church in America that was fully integrated, white and black, in its membership and its leadership. Fellowship Church was a phenomenon. It drew wide attention for Thurman's compelling preaching, but also as an exemplar for religion, as a resource for social change, not so much a spur to action as a source of inspiration for individuals to fully live their commitments. Thurman stayed in San Francisco nearly 10 years before he was called as Dean of the Chapel at Boston University, where he stayed until 1965. Once again, he was a groundbreaker, the first black person to serve as a religious leader in a majority white university. It was there that he came to know Martin Luther King Jr., urging on him Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance. And though King was a major influence on other leaders in the civil rights movements, while Thurman sat on boards at the NAACP and CORE, he never made his way to the marches. Instead, he centered his work in spiritual renewal, the work of attending to the growing edge we spoke of at the beginning. It's something we continue to struggle with today, seeking the tools to dismantle the structures of white supremacy that dog us still. Generation after generation, the 400-year-old campaign of terror erupts at us again and again like crabgrass we can't seem to eradicate. Thurman knew all about this, and yet throughout his life he remained hopeful, and his hope was centered in the belief in a quiet center within, which he says gives us the peace of the eternal in every step. This was for him a visceral truth that he felt going back to his youth, where he wandered the beaches of Florida. He held his breath and watched the stars. It was, he said, as if all things and I were one lung through which all life breathed. Not only was I aware of the vast rhythm enveloping all, but I was part of it, and it was part of me. This mystical perspective frustrated some of his students and followers, who hoped to see him in a more activist stance. Yet his pastoral presence was a grounding for them, and many others across religious traditions. Thurman had the sense that there was a truth underlying all other truths, a stillness that each of us finds and names in our own ways that is our refuge. And in that stillness is the seed for growth toward wholeness. It is there, in that which impels us to growth, that Thurman located his hope. A hope begun in individual exploration, but realized, finally, in community. We shouldn't diminish the difficulty of that happening. Community is hard. It tests us in many ways, challenges our presumptions and projections, all the woes and resentments that we carried forward in our lives. We are not done with our soul work when we arrive, but once there, fully present, courageous, and compassionate, the stage is set for something that first nudges us, that urges us toward greater wholeness and connection, to something new, where hope is renewed, where the growing edge of all things appears.